We've been waiting for you.
Yeah.
I know, sorry, mate. We had pig weigh-ins, 4-H. It's really good.
Did you make weight?
Do you have any?
We can wait
Just
tomorrow.
getting, so.
That was close.
I was stressing on my, oh my gosh, get that
I'm
pig
making
out there
weight.
now. I don't think you have to pack it out there.
Not that I want to be. Thanks for coming. You know, I've been probably the worst at attending some of these meetings lately, but I'm here tonight, we're all here. We're gonna have a third meeting.
There will be, this is a public meeting, so this is the last public
Yeah,
meeting.
last public meeting. So this is a housing needs analysis. We're gonna go over, Beth Goodman has got the presentation here on the, feel free to ask any questions. She'll walk us through this and get some updates on where we're at with our housing needs. Obviously, one realtor here, we know where there's a housing issue going on, and it's only gonna get worse as Red Rock and the solar outfits start full construction and get everybody here. So any ideas that you might have are great, and then we will continue to move forward. Eventually, the council, both for Lakeview and then also the city council up in Paisley, will adopt the findings that we come up with here. So any input, comments would be great, and we'll put them into the plan and see where we can improve on this document that we're moving forward, since most of us in the room are from here and we should know. So other than that, I think everybody else knows each other. Mike, you might not know Scott Edelman from DLC at my Bend office. So
And Mike?
other than that,
Nice to meet you. Yes, sir.
Mike.
See, not Dave at all,
Yep.
Randy.
We met before, yeah.
If you didn't hear, all right, yeah.
Saying I
Yeah, that-
couldn't remember your name, I thought it was Dave.
Yeah, not Scott.
And if you couldn't hear, I'm with the Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Ah, good, good. Turn it over to Beth. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you guys for having me here. I'm actually probably gonna sit down to do the presentation, because I've been standing a bunch and that gets old. But I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I've worked with most of you guys on this project. And as Scott said, he's here for your regional representative from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. He's a resource to help the city on its next steps, which we'll talk about through the project, through the presentation. For those of you who have a phone with you, we'll be doing some phone polling a little bit later. So I'll encourage you to have your phone available. It's really easy, it just involves texting. So even if you have a flip phone, you can do this. So what we're going to do here this evening is do an introduction of what a housing needs analysis is and what we're doing here and why we're looking at it. Do a review of the findings of the housing needs analysis, and then talk more about housing strategy. So what do we do going forward? What are the city's options? I'd like you guys just to ask questions as we go along. If you have concerns or anything like that, and at the end if you have more concerns that you want to talk through, then we should certainly do that. And then we'll talk about next steps. Yeah, some of the pictures we've got in here are a little bit overly pretty. So why are Lakeview and Paisley doing a housing needs analysis? Well, at the broadest level, a housing needs analysis is designed to look at how much growth are we expecting in the area, both in population and in housing growth. What's interesting here in Salem, I was trying not to merge Paisley and Lakeview.
And you got what?
That came out funny. So here in Lakeview is, we're not looking at any population growth based on the official forecast for population growth. That doesn't mean you don't have any housing need, and it doesn't mean that you don't have some critical housing needs. And so we'll talk about that more as we go through this. Also, our housing needs looks at housing needs by income level. So we'll talk a lot about affordability and how that's affecting things. We look at buildable land. I'll talk about what buildable land is in the context of a housing needs analysis and what we're finding. And then a lot of the information that's useful coming out of this is really about housing policy and identifying new policies that the city might be looking at. There's a whole housing strategy that we're still working on. that we will talk about some of the policies in there. So there's really three parts to the housing needs analysis. The housing needs part is really the demand analysis, and that looks at population growth, demographics, socioeconomic, so income characteristics. It also looks at housing market characteristics, other sorts of things. The residential buildable lands inventory, its main purpose is to identify land that's vacant and partially vacant, and it's unconstrained. And we'll look at that, some maps there, and then the housing strategy. And welcome, sir. If you have a cell phone, you'll need it a little bit later. Excellent. Should have said on the flyers, bring your cell phone. All right, so housing needs analysis, it's a report, and it's a strategy document. You'll have both of them. It's a technical report that will inform the city's decisions about housing policy. But they're both just really the beginning. After the project ends, there's really a lot of work with Planning Commission and City Council or Town Council on implementation of the policies that come out of this. So looking at revising comprehensive plan policies. You guys have a rather old comprehensive plan for housing. This gives you a new factual basis for it, and it gives you the opportunity to work with the housing strategy, the comprehensive plan policies, the drafts we put in there, to refine those as you need to. And there are objectives also that could probably be in your comprehensive plan. And to adopt the housing needs analysis and the new comp plan policies together. And then you can start making zoning code changes based on the new information in your comprehensive plan. Why is it bad to have a comprehensive plan that is, well, not quite older than anybody in the room, but old? Because if you want to make a change, I'm figuring 1980. I know Dawn was born out, before 1980.
Yeah.
She said so earlier today.
Thank you, but I'm way older than that.
Exactly. Exactly. So do I. So I was calling your comp plan old, not the people in the room.
Older than some of us. Well, some are. Okay.
So if you want to make changes to your zoning ordinance, you really, and changes to how land is zoned or designated, you really should be looking at what your comprehensive plan policies are and what you understand of your housing market through your housing needs analysis. So this will give you something fresh to be working with. And then one of the major issues for Lakeview, this isn't going to surprise any of you guys, is about housing condition and need for housing rehabilitation. As well as need for affordable housing that's affordable at low and middle incomes, which we'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. So this gives you information to support policy development that may begin to address those sorts of issues. I guess my big point here is you've got a lot of work to do still, sadly. This is just the beginning, the end of the beginning. So we've had an advisory committee who has been working with us throughout the housing needs analysis. Many of the people in the room are on the advisory committee meeting, the advisory committee. We'll have our 5th and last meeting in early June. This is the second of 2 public meetings, and we will be completing the housing needs analysis by June 28th, because that is when the grant ends, and Scott will take me down if I don't have it to him by then, or maybe his one of his other coworkers will. So talking about housing. We talk about housing and the housing needs analysis in 3 big categories of housing. There's single-family detached, which includes things like manufactured homes and mobile homes. It can also include things like cottage housing. Single-family attached, which includes things like townhouses. And then multifamily, which is all housing that's 2 or more units in the structure. So an apartment building, a triplex, all of those come under multifamily. We talk about them in those 3 categories of housing because Oregon law requires that the city plan for at least these 3 categories. These are called needed housing types. And other housing types that are needed housing types slot in under these really nicely. So government-assisted housing can be any of these housing types. Let's see, housing for farm workers, if it's not at the farm, it can be any of these housing types. Manufactured homes in parks, they're obviously a single-family housing type. So behind all of this, and behind how we're doing a lot of this, is a lot of law and administrative rules and legal precedents. This is my way of telling you that as we talk about a lot of this, we're doing it in some of these ways because law requires us to, and in other ways because it makes sense to do it that way. So before I go on, do you guys have any questions? I go kind of fast sometimes. All right. So when you're looking at housing growth and housing demand, and what kind of housing are people going to need over the next 20 years for people moving in here, even though we've said that there's no population growth? That doesn't matter. You think about housing in the context of three big characteristics. A household chooses their housing or the housing that they live in by necessity based on age, so the age of the adults in the household, based on household composition and income. So as a person ages, generally speaking, their income increases until retirement age. As they age, their household composition changes. So you go from being a single adult and perhaps in a pair, and then perhaps you have children, and eventually the children hopefully move out. And then you're a pair or a single adult again. And this sort of stereotypical version of what people go through in their lifetime at least illustrates that their housing needs change as their household composition changes, as age changes. And the income is in a lot of ways the biggest determiner of what kind of housing people live in and choose. Scott, I could always give you that graphic. So I'm not going to go through all of the demographics we have in the Housing Needs Analysis Report. It is long, you guys can certainly read it. There's a lot of information in there. But looking at changes in age is one place I'll pause on. So when we look at the changes in age in Lakeview, it ends up being pretty interesting where you're seeing between 2000 and 2012 to 16, you're seeing growth in people under 5 years old, and growth in people 18 to 24 years old. What that says to me is that Lakeview has attracted some younger households, or they've retained some younger households, some adults that have children, that kind of thing, younger children. You've lost some population in the 5 to 17 year age range. That's probably partially because of they've just become older and fallen into the 18 to 24 year range. What's also interesting is your population of people 65 and older has stayed stable between 2000 and now, essentially. That's not true in an awful lot of communities. In a lot of communities, population over 65, the percentage of that has increased because we all know that baby boomers are sadly getting older and slipping into that age group. So when we look at what we're expecting in the future, across Oregon, across the nation, we're expecting baby boomers to continue to get older and to continue to account for a larger percentage of the population. And that's certainly what we're expecting in Lake County also. So what does that mean for housing needs? Well, what do people, let's say 65 years and older, want in housing? The national surveys say that people want to stay in their home, generally speaking, as long as they can. They want to age in place. If they can't stay in their home, a lot of people want to stay in their community, so age in place in their community. There's a small group of seniors who want to downsize, so they don't want to stay in their home. They want something that's smaller and easier to care for. That's either by choice, their preference, or by necessity. So as you get older, it's harder to mow all of that lawn and walk up all of those stairs, so maybe you choose a different housing type. In Lakeview here, as in many of our rural cities, most of the housing is single-family detached. You don't have a lot of multifamily housing. You don't have a lot of different choices of different housing types. And so one of the implications here is looking at a wider range of housing choices. So when you also think about one of the other demographic changes we're seeing the millennials who are now between 20 and 40 years old. They're continuing to age, they're forming households, their households will change as some of them have kids. The group behind them, Gen Z, is the cute name I've heard for them. They'll also be forming their households over this next 20 years. So there's going to be housing demand from younger people who are moving out of their parents' household, out on their own. What are they going to need? Well, we know that millennials, some of them have had a slower start in their careers. So there's some economic implications. They haven't had the opportunity to get as much higher paying jobs as some younger groups had in the past. Some of them have large college debt, so that's another issue. So we look at housing affordability issues. Maybe as millennials are younger, they by necessity rent. So you have to have enough rental housing. As they get older, the surveys we've seen about what millennials want is something close to what their parents had. They want a single family unit. In some cases, especially in a bigger city, it's a single family unit closer to downtown. In a place like Lakeview, it might be enough to have a single family unit where it's just not that hard to get to downtown. Maybe you still drive, maybe it's walkable. But the town here is just not that big until you get to the extreme edges of it. So looking at housing need, again for millennials, suggests a wider range of housing need as well. I'm not going to, is anybody here from Paisley? I'm not going to talk as much about Paisley. You can just see that their age profile is very different. They've got a lot of older people comparatively. Okay, so then we look at the fact that housing is housing is becoming less affordable over time. So this slide is really about households that are cost burdened. So a household is cost burdened if it's paying 30% or more of its income on housing costs. And so that's 30% or more of gross income on housing costs. And housing costs, if you rent, are the cost of rent and some utilities. If you own, it's the cost of your mortgage, some utilities, interest, interest isn't the right word, taxes, the opposite of interest, taxes and insurance. So in Lakeview, 32% of all households are cost burdened. When you look at renters, it's 50% of renters and 18% of owners. In the housing needs analysis, we have some charts that show households that are severely cost burdened, so they pay 50% or more of their income on housing costs. And those are the folks who are really in trouble. I don't remember the exact percentage in Lakeview, but it's a fair number of renters who are
So I have a question. So on the graph, the top bar, 32% looks like cost burden, but in the text at the left, Lakeview, it says owners are 18. Is 32 the blend of renters and owners?
yeah, it's all households.
Okay.
Yep. So what you're seeing here in Lakeview, at 50% of renters, I'm sorry to say it's very similar to what you're seeing across the state. I'm sorry to say it because it's half of your renters are paying at least 30% of their income on housing, and that's just it's kind of devastating. That's what you're seeing across most cities, and you're seeing across the state. That's increased over the last decade and more, as housing has just simply become more expensive. So one way to look at the future distribution of housing, or the distribution of housing now by income group, is in these categories of income. So in Lake County, the median family income is $46,000. So when you look at the lowest income group, they earn 30% of median family income or less. The highest group earns 120% of median family income or more at $55,000. So when you look at the two lowest groups, the 30% and 50% of median family income, what they can afford at most at $23,000 is $570 in rent. I forgot to look up your average rents before this meeting. It's considerably higher than $570. I believe maybe you're a realtor. What's the average sales price you're seeing? I thought we had a... Randy, I'm sorry. Randy, what's the average sales price?
It's hard.
120.
120? Okay. So a household that's earning at least 80% of median family income could afford the average sales price. This is why your owners aren't cost burdened as often as your renters are. Rents are just proportionately high compared to incomes, whereas housing prices, probably in part because there's some condition issues, are not as high. And so if we look at this, 12% of your households, 20% of your households have income below 30% of median family income. 12% have income between 30 and 50%. 16% between 50 and 80, 17% between 80 and 100, and then 36% have income above 120%. So these are your households that are certainly doing okay in terms of housing affordability. So are these households. The ones below, below 80% of median family income are in trouble, potentially. Some of them aren't. That's typical. This is very typical of what you see across the state once you start stratifying households by median family income. When you're looking at what new housing, newly built housing is selling for, Randy, am I wrong that it's selling for probably 160 or above? If you had newly built housing?
Say that again, I'm sorry?
Newly built housing, how much is it selling for?
We don't have newly built housing.
Okay. If you had any, you would probably sell for 160 or above.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely. I mean, you can't build a cracker box for that nowadays.
You can't, indeed. And so you see some of the issue here is that housing that's newly built is often just affordable in this income range. So if we go to the next slide, what this slide is showing us is the same income groups, and then it's showing us different housing types and some of the common characteristics. So over here, you've got less expensive housing that's predominantly renter occupied, and it's existing construction. So it's not new construction. For the lowest two groups, what's going to be affordable, but not cost burden, is going to be government subsidized housing. When you come up here to the higher group, you've got predominantly owner occupied, probably in these two groups, and maybe in the 80% also. Predominantly owner occupied, if you had new construction, it'd probably be affordable here. When you look at the different types of housing that one might get, things like manufactured homes in parks or in lots are going to be affordable kind of more over here. If you allowed cottage housing, that would probably be affordable in here. Small lot single family, large lot single family. Townhouses can come in many different varieties, especially if they're government subsidized. Then when we look at multifamily housing, you've got your low amenity apartments that can be close to affordable, especially if they're government subsidized, towards the end. And then looking at the whole wide range of apartments, quads, triplexes, duplexes, they're going to be affordable, even newly built maybe is right here. I'm not really sure that Lakeview is going to be looking at any multifamily owner-occupied housing, certainly not in the next few years, and maybe not longer than that. But that would be condominiums if you got it. So does this way of thinking about housing and housing price make some sense to you? Ginger shrugs her shoulder. I can understand that.
Well, it's sort of what we talked about earlier today about being with the newer housing, or, building. I'm not sure that it can be done, well, like Randy said, you can't build anything except a cracker box for 160 here.
Right, yeah.
So that's the only piece that I know. The rest of it seems reasonable.
So, your population forecast from Portland State University, this must be reflecting some of the stuff going on with Red Rock. It shows you have a population increase, and then over our 20-year period, so planning for a 20-year period, essentially population is flat, decreasing by 2 residents. Now what we've heard from our economic development people, because we're also doing an economic opportunities analysis, is we've heard that that one of the big barriers to economic development is having housing that is in good enough condition. So the Forest Service, I think, has said that they've got a number of job openings. I think I've heard the number 30 battered around. 50.
50 was the last thing I heard.
Okay. A lot of job openings that they would like to have in Paisley, but people simply aren't able to find housing that's in good enough condition. That's also affordable to them. Obviously Red Rock, I believe Ginger, you said that permanent jobs is expected to be about 40 permanent jobs. Obviously construction's going on, so you don't have those 40 people living here now, 40 households. It's going to be hard to find housing for those households. So sort of ignore that. I don't think the forecast is right. I think it's wrong, but it's the one we have and the one we have to work with. But it's okay in a certain sense because I'll explain a little bit later why it's okay. Your availability of land is not going to prevent policy changes that might help improve the housing market. So anyway, I'll leave that alone for a few moments. Paisley, we'll skip that. So, what I'm characterizing in the housing needs analysis is even though you're not looking at demand for new housing, you do have demand for housing as a result of a need for replacement housing, especially the stuff that's in such poor condition that it just can't be rehabilitated in any reasonable way. Housing for seasonal workers, we also have heard that's a big deal. For the Forest Service, I think for BLM, firefighting, other things probably as well. So seasonal housing is an issue. And then unmet workforce housing is an issue.
Isn't this slide inconsistent with the one you just showed? So
Yes. This one says that by the forecast, it's the official forecast we have to use, there's not going to be demand for housing.
this one says there's going to be an increase in population,
But
right?
not over the 20-year period.
Not in year 1 and year 20, but in
Yeah.
the middle, there is an increase.
And that there'll be a decrease then.
Yes, but then the next slide says there is no additional demand from population growth. How can that be right?
Because we're looking at population growth between 2019 and 2039. It's long-term population growth.
Sure, but what do you do in the middle?
That's exactly where I think you guys are stuck.
Yeah.
So over the 20-year period, there's not long-term demand, but there is demand, as I was saying, from workforce, from seasonal workers, that kind of thing. In other words, this is saying that your population's going to grow and then it's going to drop
But our
off.
population isn't going to grow if we don't have housing to allow it to grow.
And that is, yes, exactly.
So that chart can't be, that's a prediction, right?
That's a forecast,
That's a
yes.
forecast, right? And you take it to the next slide and it says it's not going to happen. And it might not happen if we don't have any housing, but it's not
So-
true that demand won't grow. Demand,
So there's no demand for new housing from population growth over between 2019 and 2039. But when you look at it in more detail, I'm saying that there is demand for housing
Yes, there is. There is no demand for new housing in year 20, is
Yes.
what that previous slide said. But
Mhm.
between years 1 and 20, there is demand.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
We're agreeing, we're just disagreeing
Yeah,
about
different- yeah,
semantics
that's
a little
fine,
bit. So,
Can I,
yes, ma'am.
and there's demand right now.
Yes, there is.
There's not.
My husband gets calls, 2 to 4 calls a week
Uh-huh.
for, where can we rent? Where can we stay?
Right.
Half of them are, we don't have money, there's
Yes.
a huge demand in Lakeview.
I will not disagree with you, that there is demand. And the housing needs analysis, the way the conclusions come out is saying, yeah, the forecast doesn't say much, but let's look beyond that. Ginger?
Some of that I think is driven by affordability. I think there are places that are available, but not for some of the folks that Donna and Mike are probably getting calls.
That
So
makes
there's
sense.
a couple of, there's a couple of different things about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People need housing for less than $400.
Yeah.
They need something
Yeah.
around 300 that they can navigate.
And
And that's.
if you're gonna increase your supply of housing in that income category at the $300, $400, the only thing that's gonna make that is government subsidized housing.
Subsidized, it's gotta be subsidized,
Mhm.
because there's no other way.
Yes, indeed. I will not disagree with you.
In larger cities
Uh-huh,
that you've done studies with,
uh-huh.
okay, how does the subsidy work with the developer? Because there's a lot of new housing for low-income housing. I see it all the time on the Metro News.
Yeah.
Okay, and so forth, that they're projecting and looking and building. And so how does that developer make a buck?
Well,
Because obviously the developer probably doesn't hold on to that property long-term, okay, but whoever is footing the bill for this, it's gotta be sold or maintained within the company or however they form their organization.
well, first of all, understand that I'm not a developer, and I'm certainly not a developer of low-income housing. I'm an observer from the outside who's observed some things. So first of all, when you're really talking about housing that's affordable at that less than 50,000, less than 50% of median family income, that's affordable at $570 a month or less. There are, in bigger housing markets, there are occasionally for-profit developers who do this, and I have to imagine that their margins are razor thin. I think they usually are developing in the 80% of median family income, so that middle income sort of area. Generally speaking, otherwise, you have things like your housing authority, you've got your nonprofit developers, who they aren't making a buck off of it. They're paying their staff, they're paying people to do construction, that kind of thing. But they're not taking profit out of the housing. So how do they manage to do this? Well, I've heard on a number of different affordable housing projects, they have like 15 to 20 sources of funding. And some of the sources of funding may well be, let's say they're a nonprofit and they manage to do some fundraising. So maybe there's some of that in there. They get low-income housing tax credits, which don't ask me how low-income housing tax credits work because they're really complicated and it's too much for here. But maybe they're really lucky and they get the low-income housing tax credits that are the really valuable ones, which are really competitive and hard to get. So they get a chunk of funding from there. Maybe they've got some money out of HUD, so some funding from there. Maybe the city's got some CDBG, development block grant money that goes in there, some home funds. Maybe the city had a piece of land that they could contribute, and thus land cost isn't a factor. Maybe the city also offers a tax exemption, a property tax exemption, which maybe, let's say the city actually taxes nonprofit affordable housing. They're basically piling up this enormously complicated funding stream. And that's how they do it. It's incredibly complicated from what I understand. So they do it with all these different programs and piecing it together. So.
In addition to land, you know, the city or the municipality or whoever's sponsoring this development of low income can also underwrite utilities, which normally the developers have to pay for, so,
Right.
you know,
System development charges.
sidewalk, you know, all those sorts of things. And also there are trades that happen in a larger development context. So let's say you're a developer in Portland and you want to develop high-end houses. Why? Because there's a large profit margin and a large demand these days. And so in order to be able to get the permit and approval to do that development, you may need to contribute in some way to a less profitable development. So there are offsets.
So you're mitigating.
That's right, that, you know, compensate you for, you know, and so there are trades that happen all the time.
I just never knew how it was feasible to be done, you know.
It's very complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of horse trading that goes along. So I'm going to, welcome.
A little late.
I'm going to continue if you guys don't mind. So we're looking at affordability is driving need for housing. As you said, there are people who need housing that's affordable at $300 a month, and there's just not that in the housing market, or not much of that. Demographic trends and workforce trends, in other words, you've got a growing workforce, that suggests an increase in demand for a wider range of housing types, both for owner and renter, and existing housing conditions are really poor. So all of that suggests that, you know, Lakeview may need something other than single-family detached housing. And we'll talk about those other housing types in more detail in a few minutes. This is the demand side of the discussion. Let's talk about the land side of the discussion for a few minutes. So when we did the buildable lands inventory, we start off looking at the whole city inside the urban growth boundary, let's see, here's your city limit line right here. So I think this is inside the city limits. This is outside the city limits. So we're looking at this urbanizing area, which is between the city limits and the urban growth boundary, as well as everything in your city limits. Here we're showing all the different types of housing, all the different types of land. In the buildable lands inventory for housing, we're just looking at land that is residential. So this bright yellow, there's another shade of yellow, like right here. We've also looked at some commercial lands, but generally speaking, we haven't assumed that they would accommodate growth. So we start right there. And then we go through for all the residential lands, and we classify lands. We classify it into land that's vacant. So that's land that has either no development on it, or an improvement, a building that's worth less than $10,000. We identify land that's developed, and that development is an improvement, a building that's worth more than $10,000. It might be publicly owned land, so parkland, cemeteries, so semi-publicly owned. Churches, we're not assuming your cemeteries or churches or parks are going to develop for housing, even if they have no improvement on them. And then we classify, there's a little piece of land left over that's land that's partially vacant. So it's a parcel that's big enough that it could easily subdivide and have more housing on it in the future. So if you imagine if you have a 5-acre piece of land and it's got 1 unit on it and it's zoned to allow, say, 4 dwelling units on an acre. So you take that 1 unit, all the rest of it could be developed. That's partially vacant. So we look at your vacant and your partially vacant land, and we say, what are the constraints You guys are incredibly constrained. So land in the floodplain and floodway, we've considered unbuildable. So even if it's vacant in the floodway or floodplain. Steep slopes, so slopes above 25%, those are unbuildable. And wetlands, those are considered unbuildable. So we take all of those out of the inventory of vacant and partially vacant. We're not assuming any future development on those. When we look at it within the urban growth boundary, you've got 300 acres of residential land. You can see where that is. It's the bright yellow. It's where most of your opportunity is. You've got 13 acres of residential multifamily land. It's mostly here, when a little bit here. I believe that's sloped. Not a great place for multifamily, given that it's sloped and it's hard to build multifamily on slopes. It's hard enough to build single family on slopes, but obviously it happens some. Your highway commercial and your commercial central, you've got some land in there, but we didn't assume at this point any capacity on it. But of course, housing could be built, especially along highway commercial. I'm gonna skip Paisley, so I don't think there's anyone here from Paisley, unless the young lady is, okay? Oh, thank you. So, since we saw no technical, based on your population forecast, no technical demand for new housing based on your population forecast, and you guys have 300 acres of residential housing, you guys have enough land. Land is not the issue. You may not have enough land that has services. Services are certainly an issue. Developing land here, up in your slopes, up here, that may be challenging. Looking at land up here, I think that is in city limits here, but that land up there isn't in city limits. So servicing that land up there is going to be really hard. But you know, some of these smaller parcels here in town, and maybe over here, down here, they may be a little bit easier to service, or they may have some existing services. They'll probably still have some service challenges. My point here, why this matters, is you're not looking at an urban growth boundary expansion. You don't need more land to fix this problem. You need services and willing landowners and a development community and so on and so forth to fix this problem. So here's the strategies we're going to talk about in a few moments. Before we go on to talking about strategies, people have questions or? Yes, sir.
Did you do an inventory of the housing units that we have available to us now?
There is information in there about the number of units, the types of units in Lakeview, not Salem. Are you asking, did we do an inventory of condition of units? And we definitely did not.
No. So, for example, you know, I'm thinking, what is the percentage of single? So you had 3 categories in the beginning slide, right? You have detached, a family. You have semi-attached, and then you have multi-family.
Now I'm going to go off the top of my head because I don't have it with me right now, and I haven't looked at those numbers recently. But I can look at it after this and show you. I think it's somewhere around 70% of your housing is single-family detached. Less than 5% is townhouse, and the rest is multifamily.
And how does that match up to other towns that are our peer set?
It's pretty similar. You haven't seen much development of multifamily housing. When we look at building permits, there just hasn't been development of multifamily housing here in Lakeview in the last 10, 20 years.
And then if we take out the low income, the government subsidized multifamily housing, what's left?
I don't know. You would be able to do that by, there's information in the report that would allow us to do that, and I haven't specifically done it, but I'm going to bet that the government subsidizes a fair chunk of your multifamily housing. You just don't have much multifamily housing.
Right, so I think what at least, I mean, I'm new here, but I think what I'm seeing or hearing is that, people are making multifamily housing ad hoc. So you know, if you're a person who has a pretty low income, but you have a need to live someplace,
Yes.
and you can't afford to have your own residence, your detached residence, and there aren't any condominiums, and maybe you don't, for whatever reason, qualify for government housing subsidy, so, you know, you pile into a manufactured home with a bunch of friends, or you couch surf, or
Yeah.
you know, you have some other, you know, you put a trailer or an old motorhome on somebody else's land.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that, you know, one of the things that we need to do in order to figure out the best path forward is to do an inventory of who's living where and in what conditions, because I think you might find that, you know, there's a big case to be made for additional subsidy or something, because there's a lot of people that are not properly being counted.
So I don't think you need to do that work to make that case. I think we've got information enough here that makes that case. Frankly, when you look at it and you look at the rates of cost burden, so we know that 50% of renters are cost burden. We know how many renters there are.
But that's exactly it, Beth. I don't think you do. I don't
You
think
think
you
the
do.
census is undercounting?
Yeah, I'm afraid so, yeah, because
Okay.
you've got all these people that are doing sort of impromptu, ad hoc, sort of living arrangements, and I don't think that's being counted. And so, if I'm a developer and I'm
Mhm.
trying to, you know, build, say, government subsidized or some kind, town subsidized or something housing, what I want to know is exactly how many people are there out there, and what can they afford, so that I can build the right property at the right price point with the right return on my investment.
So let's say we're off immensely by 50%.
Yes.
We know that there are 246 households, so between 250 and 500 households, that can only afford $350 a month in rent. We know that there's 150, and let's say that's up to 300 households, that can afford between 30 and 50%. Those are your subsidized households. So maybe that's as few as 400 and as many as 800 households. To make the case to your housing authority, your housing authority would already understand the need in large part. You don't have to make a case to them as a developer. To make the case to the nonprofit developers, just simply looking at the amount of subsidized housing you have in town and looking at these numbers, there's demand enough. It isn't, is there enough demand? There's already too much demand. It would be really hard to build 400 subsidized housing units. We've got information in the report that shows the number of households at different income levels, where there's deficits, that kind of thing. It's a lot more nuanced than I'm presenting here. So we show already the number of households that are living in housing that's unaffordable to them at different income levels. We know there's a big deficit. And if the deficit is undercounted, meeting the deficit that you've got already is going to be a big challenge. Exceeding it is it's not possible in most cities. There's just not enough funding for it in most places. When you look at where is some of the funding for this going to come from, well, some of it's going to come from Oregon Housing and Community Services. They're looking at, they've made a commitment in their statewide housing plan to increase affordable housing, so government subsidized housing, in rural areas by 75%. They're working right now on a grant program, I think it's going to be grant, I'm not actually sure what it is, a program to work with rural communities on this, because they feel like they've underserved rural communities in the past. They're going to be a key partner. Your housing needs analysis is going to show plenty of need. If it understates the need some, that's possible. But how much money do you want to spend doing the inventory that you just suggested?
Well, we have an opportunity next year, right? It's a census year. Comes every 10 years. And, you know, isn't there a way to combine?
So you've got two different types of census. I'm sorry for smiling at you. I don't mean that in any way. The decennial census, that collects information, and it collects some basic information about households. And when we last had it done, about 75% of people in Oregon responded. So you want a really good response here, so go for that. But what that tells us is number of people per unit. So they'll get you household size. It tells you nothing about income, and it tells you nothing about housing costs or housing types. The income, the housing costs, the housing types, that kind of thing comes from the American Community Survey, which is conducted every year. And that's where a lot of the information that you're looking at here and you're saying is undercounted is from. It's over a 5-year period. Lakeview is small enough, it's smaller than 65,000 people. So it gets a 5-year American Community Survey sample. So it's, in this report, a lot of the information is 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16 put together and analyzed that way. You're not going to get enough out of the new census numbers to tell you a lot. Change in household size doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the reason for the household size. You'd want to look at things like overcrowding and that kind of thing, and that comes from the American Community Survey. And you already have that information.
From what year?
From any of the years. The newest one out that came out in December is 2013 to 17. And I'm happy to talk to you about that more.
That's good.
But the decennial census is going to provide important information, but it just doesn't provide as much important information as it used to, because luckily we have the American Community Survey. Used to be that between census years you knew nothing.
Right.
Now we know something. Yes, ma'am.
So I think that they just had a homeless survey.
The point in time count, that happens every year.
Yeah.
in
and
January.
that was yeah,
Mhm.
not very long ago.
That's helpful.
And they,
Probably that
and
would
they
be
made
helpful.
a big push to try to get couch surfing people and
Yeah,
all those things.
And that's
Right,
all,
so-
That could be helpful.
Right, it just seems like that number 246 households at the lowest end feels
Right.
low, but I don't have any data, I just wondered if that did.
the point in time count can give you some ideas about that, but it's a point in time count for a single night.
Right.
And do you catch everybody, do you not? But the census, it does undercount some groups of people. It undercounts people who are homeless. It undercounts minority groups. Definitely, there are people who are systematically undercounted in the census.
Yeah.
So yeah. I'm going to go on, if you guys don't mind, and talk some policy stuff. Because I won't disagree with you here, Mike. The housing need is desperate.
It's dramatic, yeah.
Yes.
If I can just interject really quickly, we're attempting to and hoping to address some of this in the Brownfields project in the community engagement portion of it. And our consultant out of Georgia is already looking at what it might cost to do a blighted properties inventory, which would capture some of our housing, our blighted housing. So it's like we've got different planning pieces that are going on that are having pieces of what we're talking about, and I think we'll be able to pull some of those together and come up with a little better picture than what we've had ever for a long time. If that makes any sense.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll have it by June.
oh, wait.
I'm just kidding.
Which
Like,
year?
whoa.
Yeah, what's your year?
2021, you know.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so take out your telephone. So we're gonna do some phone voting in a few moments. So what I'm talking about here is I'm excited about the phone voting. I like it. I like it a lot. So what we're going through here is some of the key strategies that we're talking about with the project advisory committee. The first strategy ends up being about a 20-year supply of land. You already have a 20-year supply of land, but since we know you've got housing need that's not really showing up in the numbers, one of the policies is about encouraging vacant and partially vacant lands in the urban area with existing services. Those are your short-term supply of land. Those are where you can get development to happen sooner rather than later, if you have willing landowners, and you can make the finances work. because, you know, I'm not talking finances here, but it's always underneath of everything, if you can make the finances work. We also suggest you identifying more opportunities for residential multifamily land. You don't have a lot of it, it's on a hillside. You probably should look at some rezoning, or do something to get a little bit more land where you can get multifamily. If you're not getting multifamily development, it's entirely probable that your land base is one of the problems. And so, you know, is there an area that has existing services that you can rezone for multifamily land? It doesn't have to be a lot of land. A couple of acres, you know, an acre or two. If you think about an apartment building that's, say it's a 3-story apartment building on an acre of land, that can end up providing, you know, 10, 20 dwelling units. Depending, and I'd say, you know, maybe 20 dwelling units, depending on your parking requirements and all of those other things. That would be significant. And provide opportunities for a wider range of housing. I'm gonna talk about that more in a few minutes.
So, so if the premise is that we have plenty of developable residential land, and that's based on,
Yep.
on this slide. I'm not the realtor here, but, I mean, just looking at what I know about this town, I'm not sure that these are really developable residential parcels. I mean, do you have a view about that? Because if this is wrong, then your study doesn't work, right?
So what does developable mean to you?
Well, I mean, you know, it means that if somebody built a property, that somebody would live there, you know, that you could have an economically viable project.
That's not what we mean by developable. We mean that it's vacant and it's not constrained. We're saying that one of the big issues is serviceable land that's got services to it.
There's our biggest problem.
And we talk about that some in a few minutes, and it's actually, in a lot of ways, one of the hardest problems to address. The town doesn't have money to pay for the services. If you have developers paying for the services, especially if you're talking about a big extension of services, it makes it even less financially feasible to develop.
Exactly right, yeah, that's right. Or if it's in a location that's, you know, right next to, say, a timber mill, or, you know, you know, I don't know, a perlite factory or something like that, right? I mean, if these aren't realistic development areas, then I'm not sure that this works, whether or not there are services.
You don't need all 300 acres. You need some portion
Right.
of that 300 acres. I mean, if you're developing at an average density of, let's say, 7 dwelling units an acre, which is not very high. It's a little bit of multifamily and a bunch of single family. 100 acres gets you 700 units. If you're looking at it over a 20-year period, I'm willing to bet that there's 700 acres. There's 100 acres in there that if the city could afford to service it, that could be developable. So the test in goal 10 is really not so much about serviceability. Where would you go for land that was serviceable if it wasn't inside the UGB? If you were looking at outside the UGB, you'd have at least as much problem with serviceability. So even if you expanded the UGB.
Right.
So the point here is not that you don't have big problems. The point here is that the big problem isn't vacant land. The big problem, I think, is condition and its services. So who do you go to? Who do you go to? The Ghostbusters. No, sorry. Who do you go to help address that? Well, you look at things like, you look at your partners at Department of Land Conservation and Development. They know where to get some grants. They'll point you potentially in the direction. Does Business Oregon do grants for infrastructure that's not economic development? I think they do, but I'm not sure.
Some.
So, you know, grants about water and wastewater, if you're talking about ODOT facilities, ODOT can help. So a lot of the work of implementing this is figuring out where to get the money from. And that's frankly the least interesting and hardest part. And then the other part is building it, even if you've got the services, building something that's financially feasible. And so a wider range of housing types. You know, Randy, do you build multifamily housing? Okay. So, you probably haven't tried, say, townhouses. There aren't any townhouses really in town to speak of. But maybe townhouses, maybe Randy learns about developing townhouses and decides to build some townhouses and tests out whether there's a market for this, because Randy is a daredevil.
Oh, there you go. Deep pockets too.
Exactly. Maybe we're looking at cottage housing, so small units, smaller units, which we'll talk about those in a few moments. Yes, sir. You had a question, I think?
Well, to me, the biggest issue that I'm seeing is not the land, not the services, but where do you find the builder that wants to
Yup.
come do this?
That
Because the
is,
land is here, the services are here.
that is a
Where's the
major
builder?
problem. We were having a meeting earlier today about economic development, and one of the things that we talked about a lot was housing. And one of the things that we talked about a lot was lack of, essentially construction workers, lack of contractors, that kind of thing. And really the only solution, leave aside developers as a special type of that, the only solution for that is either importing some or growing your own. And frankly, growing your own is, people who want to stay or live in Lakeview, can they go to Klamath Community College and get trained in that? Are there opportunities in the schools for more vocational training? That's kind of the systematic change you have to have, and then you have to have your daring, deep-pocketed developers. Do you have somebody who wants to try cottage housing? You may need to import some developers for novel types of housing from other parts of the state, and that's true. It's true in a lot of places. You've got some people who are building different types of housing in Bend, where they can get the prices for that. They get a premium on it. But are there opportunities to get some of those developers when Bend isn't so hot to work in Lakeview? Or maybe somebody wants to move to Lakeview. It's a very difficult piece. It's a hard one to solve. I'm not sure it's harder to find than finding money to fix infrastructure, but it's definitely a hard one to solve. And the city, what its role in solving it, because this is a city process, that's even a harder one. Does that get at what you were mentioning?
Absolutely.
All right, so in phone voting, what you do is you open your phone to acknowledge your face. You open your messaging or your texting app, and you start a new text, and in your to line, TO, you type in 22333. Well, there's only 3 threes there. There we go. And then what you're texting to that number is the second line, Lorelei Juntu, that's my boss's name, 271. Unfortunately, they didn't use my name, Beth Goodman. It's really easy.
Do they need to be caps like that?
I don't think it does. I've done it before and it wasn't caps. So you just text that message to it, and then you get a little thing that comes back. You can use mine, Roberta, if you want it. Okay. You get a thing that comes back that says, you joined Lorelei's session. When you're done, reply leave, which you don't really even have to do that. So tell me when you guys have gotten that message. Randy, do you not have a phone with you? Do you want to borrow mine?
No thanks.
Okay,
I
good.
don't text. I don't know.
It's really
I'm only
easy.
62 years old.
This
and
is
I don't-
so easy.
I don't care to. Thank
Okay,
you.
all right. All right, I won't go to you anymore. Is everybody there?
Yep.
Okay, we're just gonna do a few warm-ups. What type of house do you live in? If you live in a single-family detached, just text the letter A, it doesn't have to be capital. If you live in a manufactured or mobile home, B, so on and so forth. If anybody doesn't have a phone who wants to text, you can use mine. And we'll give a moment for everybody to finish texting, but it's probable that everybody lives here who lives in a single family detached. All right, in 5 years, what kind of housing do you think you want to live in? Single family detached. All right, so this one will be a little bit more interesting. What do you like best about living in Lakeview? So if you want to say multiple things, you can text A, space B, space D, or you can text A and then text B and then text D. Do it either way.
This would be a very cool, if the public could be involved, I mean, Whitescape.
Yeah.
Somehow.
This is honestly my first time of using Pull Everywhere. 'Cause I just
It
don't
would
do
be.
big
I mean,
meetings
it'd
all that
be
often.
really interesting to see the,
Mhm.
you know, advertised at 1 o'clock Monday morning.
Yeah,
You could get a really wide range of,
this is not a very
Data.
expensive thing. It costs a couple $100 a year or something, I think, for the type of work we're doing here. And you can see how as more people respond, it changes. We use this in my staff meeting for my company. They're asking us hard questions. So what we see is a friendly community, access to recreation, sense of safety. Those are some of the more important characteristics. So we'll go on to a few more questions that are a little more interesting. So one of the key strategies is allow for a wider range of housing to potentially allow for cottage cluster. And just so you know, the strategy says something like, evaluate allowing cottage clusters, blah, 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 blah. A cottage cluster is a small, single-family detached dwelling that's generally between 600 square feet and 1,200 square feet. It's often clustered around an existing site, around some open space or some sort of nice amenity, and developed with a nice coherent site plan. So we've got a couple of these that look really pretty. So all cottage clusters, I don't know if they look as pretty as that, but those look pretty nice. So should Lakeview allow for development of clustered cottage housing with open space or shared amenities? See, Randy, there's now a reason for you to learn to text.
I mutter through it so badly.
I understand.
I just get so, can't deal with it.
So people who answered no or yes under some circumstances, do you have particular concerns that you'd like to discuss? And you don't have to answer, you get to be anonymous if you want. I'll look at Randy because I know you can text.
So I said B, and I think, you know, I would be concerned that, you know, you'd want to find a community of common interest. So either, you know, something where you've got a bunch of families and the shared center area could be, you know, sports court or pool or something like that. Or a family of older, you know, kids have left and, you know, people like to garden or have a quieter community. But I think, you know, you might get into trouble if you get these cluster communities that don't share common interests, because the older people might not like the noise of the younger people, and you're trying to entice people away from their current housing or to improve their housing by doing this.
So I should have said that clusters are often between like 4 units, so a very small cluster. Sometimes, you know, 12 units around a cluster. They're rarely bigger than that. But you might have a cluster of clusters. So for instance, in Bend, they're doing cottage clusters. And Scott may be able to talk about this more cogently than I can, because we've actually been to some of the cottage housing. But cottage housing in Bend, no, that's tiny houses. I'll reserve that.
Beth, are clusters just the modern version of mobile home park?
No. Cottage cluster is not the modern version of mobile home parks. That's something else that we'll go on to in a few moments.
Okay.
Yes, so one of the things the city might do, if it's worried about how clusters will develop, that kind of thing, is develop the ordinance that says how they're going to develop, and then allow it conditionally in some areas, and then the conditional use permit allows the planning commission and city council to evaluate, should we allow this one or not. And so that's one way to control things a little bit. I know that Scappoose, for instance, they put a few light design requirements on the clusters, like they had a little tiny porch and required them to cluster around shared space and had some more detail about that. What you'll find is that in Washington State, cottage clusters are more common than in Oregon, but it's certainly becoming more common here.
Beth, may I
Yes,
ask,
ma'am.
are you familiar with the housing going in on Butler Market Road
In Bend.
in Bend?
Yeah.
Which housing is
I don't know
that?
which one you're talking about.
It's Hayden Homes, it has built some single-family detached, but adjacent to it, so I think it's one complete plan, are some smaller homes that are appear to be clustered, and they're rentals.
Okay,
Are
I've
you-
not seen that one.
So I know that Cottage Grove
Because Mike's
recently.
point is well taken, as the density of those are such that,
Mhm.
You would want some commonality, you would want something in common, I think.
So Cottage Grove recently approved a cottage cluster that came in at about 10 dwelling units an acre. So that's fairly, it's not really tight clustered, but that's fairly clustered. So I know that it's happening in some of our smaller communities. I mean, obviously Cottage Grove is larger than Lakeview, but it's not Venice, it's not Bend.
And I said no, just because I feel like dealing with some of the ordinances I've had to deal with. Because you do have some, like down at the Commons, or there's some on South 8th Street where there is some where they run apartments of 3. So to me, that is a little cluster, and the neighbors are constantly at each other.
Okay.
This person did this on this property, this person's flowers are in my property, and it's a constant fight.
Mhm.
And to me, it would just be a bigger fight and more for them, because you're not gonna have, there's gonna always be that one neighbor. I've never seen one block have a perfect neighborhood.
It could have an HOA with it, yeah, certainly.
So that's just my personal opinion on that.
So let's talk about a smaller version of this, tiny homes. So tiny homes are small, single family still. They're typically smaller than 500 square feet. You can cluster a lot of tiny homes on a lot. They may be the new version of mobile home parks, we'll have to see. They can be pretty fancy. If you look on the left-hand side, that's a pretty fancy little tiny home. In Bend, tiny homes are selling for like $250 a unit.
1,000?
$250,000?
250,000. Yeah, 250,000. I'm sorry, $250. No, it's 250,000
Really?
a unit. So that's a lot of money per square foot. You see another example of them over that's a little less nice, but they're still on foundations. They have a little porch, that kind of thing, over on the right-hand side. In some places, they're being used also as transitional housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. They can be constructed very inexpensively. There's a lot of different types of tiny homes. They would be at a density, generally speaking, to make this affordable, that would be higher than cottage clusters. So, should Lakeview allow for development of clustered tiny houses with open space or shared amenities?
See,
See,
I'll do that for you.
you know, one of the things I was thinking about tiny homes is that it may be a solution to some of the problems that we see around here where housing stock has declined in quality. so significantly, and you've got people who just aren't in a position to improve their home. And they're literally falling down.
Or the home isn't worth improving.
That's right, but there's land, and so, maybe you could take, both situations. They have a piece of land with a really unusable house on it, and you could swap that for another piece of land with a tiny home on it, and then, the town or the redevelopment agency or whoever it is, could dispose of that bad house, do a demolition and redevelop that for another tiny home, for another person who actually needs some help. And this would take a financial burden away from people and also improve the quality of their life, because now they don't have a house that's falling down, the water heater doesn't work, and, needs, you might be able to find a really good public subsidized solution using tiny home solutions and create a lot of positive in a town like this.
I think that's definitely a possibility. When you look at the long term, there's questions of whether tiny home maintenance and the quality of the building, does that deteriorate the same way that, say, old mobile homes have? And I don't know the answer to that. Yes, sir.
I've done a lot of research in the tiny home business.
Mm-hmm.
One of the main issues that you have is the code to which it's constructed.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time here in Oregon, you were able to take a trailer,
Mm-hmm.
license that trailer,
Mm-hmm.
and build a tiny home on it.
Mm-hmm.
And you were basically good to go. Now, you've got some issues where you cannot, excuse me, you cannot put a RV-coated tiny home into a mobile home park.
I believe that is still
And you
true.
can't, supposedly, unless your building inspector allows it, which they're the closest thing to God, so really up to them, county by county and community by community, whether these are going to be allowed. If it's constructed to a HUD code, it can't go into an RV park.
So-
And you've got some other issues on the land that you're talking about,
Mhm.
how nice it would be. You have a minimum of 1,000 square feet by Lakeview Code to put a house on.
And so that would be one of the things that would have to change.
Yeah.
But that,
Might be
I mean,
worth
that can be changed. Like, you
Can
go,
be.
where would you put them too?
Well, there's a good place to put some.
Well, I understand that, but then what about those that want walking distance? Because a lot of your elderly people that may not want their big houses, that wanna switch, like Beth had said, they're not gonna wanna walk from out by the baseball fields to come into town to go to the store. A lot of our
That's why you
older
have your
people,
senior show.
but, yeah, but still, you have a lot of our older people that don't use that even in the summertime. They
So-
like to walk uptown.
One of the things I make the point of is none of these is going to solve the problems in town on its own. All of these are possibilities to address different aspects of the problem. One of the other things I heard 20 Homes said to be potentially useful for is seasonal housing.
Yep.
So do you have fairly inexpensive tiny homes that would stand up long enough that are useful for seasonal housing? Yes, sir.
That was put into the rental market part
Mm-hmm,
versus, a homeowner,
mm-hmm,
might be completely different,
mm-hmm.
as you use. And a tiny, I've never seen a tiny home park. Do they have a parking spot? Do they have a garage?
Almost certainly no garage, because the garage would be as big as the
But
tiny
they do have
home.
a parking spot, obviously, for one vehicle.
They can. With cottage clusters and tiny home clusters, usually you put the parking spots sort of around the edges.
I see. Common area in the middle.
Pretty common area in the middle, parking somewhere off to the side.
I see.
And if your cluster isn't too big, then it's not too often long to walk.
I see in the rental market, seats in the rental market,
Mhm.
very viable.
So,
And your transitional people.
Yeah,
Right,
Yeah.
you know, so if they can just get into some, and then maybe move up, but
so what I'm hearing is it's of interest. You want to be cautious about it. Again, maybe you're looking at developing standards and doing some pilot projects and seeing how it works out.
Okay, what, now, correct me if I'm wrong. Now,
So
when you
don't
have
full jump cars.
people that have lots, because we've had a couple people that have inquired about a lot directly behind them, how can they make that one lot? Well, of course, they can't do that through us. They have to, they go to the county, right?
Are you saying they want to merge lots?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Or
So-
split, or split maybe?
If they do that, or whether they keep that second lot its own lot, they could build a tiny house on that lot, or 2 tiny houses on that lot,
If you allowed it.
if it's allowed. Or those that have big backyards that are willing to build a tiny house because everybody wants to build sheds in their backyard. The sheds are maybe 2 of those to equal a tiny house.
So a tiny house is different than accessory dwelling unit.
Okay.
So does the town now allow accessory dwelling units? I believe you did. So you already are allowed to build an accessory dwelling unit, which may look a lot like a tiny house. But generally speaking, you wouldn't necessarily allow 2 or 3 tiny houses on a lot with an existing single family.
No, I just mean the vacant lots. Because
Okay,
there
so
are some
vacant
people
lots.
that do own vacant lots here,
Yep.
but they've done nothing with.
Mm-hmm.
So why not put maybe 1 or 2 of those? Just, and it doesn't have to be a ton of them, just 2 to start, just to see how
So-
we do,
This is all in how the city writes its ordinance around this.
right?
You could allow a tiny home per lot, you could allow multiple tiny homes per lot. Usually with cottage housing, I'll start from there. Let's say your underlying zone allows 6 dwelling units per acre. Well, that's not very much for cottage housing. So maybe you allow 1.5 times the underlying, so that would take us to 9 dwelling units an acre. For tiny homes, maybe you allow 2 times the underlying, so that would take you up to 12 tiny homes per acre in that case. So you'd have to decide how many could be built on a lot, depending on size of lot, et cetera.
Right, and then there's the concern, okay, if you don't rip them out, then you end up with squatters in there. Then what do you
This
do?
is true for all types of housing.
True, because we're dealing with that now. I mean, everybody does, but it's more noticeable in a smaller town, in my opinion.
Randy, did you have a comment? Okay, thought I saw an arm over here.
Twitch.
Twitch. I'm gonna take us on, if that's okay.
So are these results being?
Yes, and I'll send it to you in a PowerPoint. I figured out how to do that yesterday or today, and really somebody figured it out for me.
Thank you.
So where do you think Lakeview should have more land for multifamily housing? We haven't really given many good choices here. But what you have a choice here to say is nowhere, or to tell me, and I can always write it down if you have a specific area.
Janine, is that multifamily, is that considered R, R2? What is that?
R2 is no longer around,
What is it? I'm sorry.
and I think it's MF, multifamily, which there's only part of the government-assisted housing that exists down on 9th Street. And the
up
one you were
north,
talking about, the second, is zoned multifamily. And then there's about a 19 or 20 acre parcel up East Street.
Up where?
On East Street.
East Street, at the end of East Street, into the hills. The property owner at the time that we were adopting zoning wanted it zone multifamily,
I see.
and it's undeveloped.
Now, is this something that you would go in for a zone change if you had residential land and ask for that to be multifamily?
Yes, it would definitely be the property owner that, if the property owner is interested, could be rezoned.
Everybody pick one.
Hey, so,
So
oh
let me
boy,
ask about
the
When
downtown.
are you messing with that?
We'd love to do too. so
Downtown,
it's
you're
switch
talking
ones.
about like empty commercial buildings that we have right now that we could turn into,
I think what I'd really be talking about was building a new building, in or somewhere near downtown, where if there was a building that was not historic and in very poor condition, demolishing it and building something new. You might be able to adapt an existing, commercial building, for housing, that's also a possibility.
because we have a number of
Unused buildings.
unused buildings,
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
what they could really use.
underused. Yeah.
I haven't thought about adaptive reuse for commercial buildings. Certainly if you were talking about a warehouse, I know how that works, but I assume you could do some adaptive reuse for commercial buildings. So what I'm seeing here is general agreement that there's need for more land for multifamily somewhere. Whether that's in downtown, or in other parts of, town, would be something I think, that would be subject, leaving downtown out for a moment, but where you want to do it would be subject to where landowners were willing and interested, I think, because I don't think you guys are the kind of city to go, you're rezoned. I live in the kind of city that does that. So I'm going to move us on so we continue through this. So rehabilitation of housing is really one of the more important strategies in this. So we've got some different choices for rehabilitation of strategy of housing. I'm going to work with this a little bit. So what, if any, approaches should Lakeview use to support rehabilitation of existing housing? Sadly, I did not make this a choose multiple ones, so you're going to have to choose your favorite one. So lower or waive building permit fees, if there are any. Look at grants. Generally speaking, grants are often given for rehabilitation that's, less than $10,000, and you could set a different boundary than that. Look at low interest loans. This is for bigger rehabilitation projects. Sometimes the low interest loans are set so that they don't come due until the house is sold. That's what some places do. Some of them make them due sooner. Look at a rebate on property taxes. John Day is doing this. When you commit to significant rehabilitation, they'll give you a rebate on your city property tax. Enforce nuisance codes. I would say that's almost certainly got to underlie any of this. So the first ones are all different carrots, and that is a stick.
You impacted that.
I
It went from 33 to 50
Yeah.
when you said that.
well, I mean, you're not going to solve the problem simply through enforcing your nuisance code, but you may cause people to work at solving the problem by enforcing your nuisance codes. Yes, sir.
Such a low interest loan,
Mhm.
where's that coming from? Where's the pool of money coming from?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
If the city is interested in having a low interest loan program, then where is the money coming from? Funding sources are a really key part of this that we've talked about some. There's not an interest, so what are your funding sources? You could use urban renewal, which you guys don't have urban renewal here, but you could have an urban renewal district where you're basically essentially bonding on the urban renewal, I forget what word it is, but the potential of the urban renewal district.
PAX.
E-
Well, a bond issue is a tax on the property.
Yes and no. So you've got an urban renewal district, and what happens in urban renewal, and I'm not an expert here, but I understand some things. So you've got the base property tax amount you get out as things are now. And this is tax increment finance. And so if you have urban renewal and somebody improves their property, there's going to be an increase in property tax because they're being assessed on more. And so this base, it all stays the same, it's all fixed. And that increase, this piece here, goes to fund the urban renewal district. And so the urban renewal district gets the tax increase out of this. This lasts for a long time, like 20 years. And that is used to pay off the bond. And Randy, that's like the 5-second half-baked version of urban renewal.
But in that difference,
That increment,
that increment there, that, but that homeowner still pays that,
yeah, they pay that,
but that difference goes into a fund.
yes. If they improve their property outside of an urban renewal district, they'd still pay the increase in assessed value.
That's right. It's just where the money's going.
Yes, and what urban renewal is really good at, it's building new infrastructure. It's things like streetscaping, beautification, I called it earlier today, charmification. It can be used for some affordable housing projects and some market rate housing projects, but you have to be careful because you need an increase in your property tax value, so if you exempt those properties, or if you build some public stuff, that's not contributing to your increased increment. So you want to do things that make the urban renewal district better and better enough that other people do things. So the Pearl District in Portland is a great example of an urban renewal thing. In Portland, their biggest investment was moving the Broadway bridgehead out of the Pearl District to where it is now. And then they had property agreements with the property owners that, with different improvements, the density of housing, density of development would increase. So it went from, I think, 14 dwelling units an acre, which isn't much, when they moved the bridgehead up to 80-some dwelling units an acre. And then you put in parks, and then you put in eventually the streetcar, which back in the 90s nobody thought would actually happen. And all of this is paid through the urban renewal district, or a lot of it's paid for through the urban renewal districts. And that's how they made the Pearl District work, probably with some other complexity that I'm not mentioning because I don't know about. So urban renewal happens to be a pretty powerful tool. You have things like construction excise tax, which the Project Advisory Committee has said let's not talk about for Lakeview. Construction excise tax is a tax on new construction. It makes housing a little bit more expensive. When you have a city as small as Lakeview that's growing as slowly as Lakeview, it's generally not going to generate enough money to be worth the hassle. Then you have things like transient lodging tax. You can sometimes use a little bit of that for housing, but you're really restricted on that. Marijuana taxes, if you have marijuana taxes in town. I know. Medford is using some of theirs for affordable housing. You can have a GO bond, a general obligation bond. That's where you're taxing people more, and that's not going to be popular here.
Very true.
So you don't have a lot of options. So yes, which of these, if any, are you going to pick, and then how are you going to pay for it? That's a whole separate other project. Just because it's difficult, though, it doesn't mean it's not worth thinking about. All right, so some of the key strategies are about supporting development of affordable housing by lowering costs of development. And when I say low-income affordable housing, what I mean there is government subsidized housing. And when I say middle-income affordable housing, I mean the housing that's for people a little bit above government subsidized, so between 50% of median family income to, say, 60% or sometimes 80%. Sometimes it's above that, but you guys just don't have a housing market like that. So looking at how the city can support development of government subsidized low-income housing, identifying surplus properties that are publicly owned that could be used for affordable housing and partner with affordable housing developers. Supporting development of all types of multifamily housing that is market rate affordable or low income affordable. And one of the supports is having land. We had more strategies in here. And we kind of pulled back from this because there was a lot of discomfort among certain PAC members with some of these strategies. Just because it's not listed here doesn't mean that the city can't do it. There's a lot of information I think we provided in the development of these policies that could be referred to later and said, well, what about this? What about that? So what actions should the town take? to support development of more housing affordable to low and middle income. So what I'm seeing is consider a 10-year abatement of taxes. There are a number of different tax abatements. One of them is the multi-unit tax abatement, which the city sets up with its criteria where it will apply. So you set up an area. You don't want to do this in your urban renewal district, by the way. Those don't cross well. It sets up an area where it will apply and sets up criteria for the multi-unit tax exemption. So Eugene's criteria, one of the little pieces, because they've given multi-unit tax exemptions, student housing before, is it's got to be multifamily and not student housing. They've got criteria for, it has to be, some percentage of the housing has to be affordable at 80% of median family income or less. There's a lot of other criteria that you could have. It's a very controllable policy. All right, so then plan for infrastructure development to support residential development. So coordinate with capital improvement plans to make sure that long-term plans for where you're going to develop infrastructure makes sense with where you want housing, where there are opportunities, that kind of thing. And then develop sources to pay for the cost of implementing the affordable housing programs, and it should say the infrastructure as well. And that's all I had. So what are our next steps? We'll finish this report up here over the next 45 days or so. Then the city is in the position of choosing whether it wants to adopt this information into its comprehensive plan and revise comprehensive plan policies. So with the economic opportunities analysis, the city is considering, something, working with the county as a process on adopting this, because a lot of your land in your urban growth boundaries also is outside the city limits and inside the county. So you might consider joint work sessions with planning commissioners and city councilors, as well as, I'm not saying that right, city councilors and board of commissioners on adopting some of this. You'll need to work with your planning commission on adopting this. And this would be the housing needs analysis. You can adopt it as an appendix to your comprehensive plan. And then you can adopt new policies, and it may or may not be the policies that the project advisory committee has developed. It may be something that the planning commission or the city council, the board of commissioners chooses to change somewhat. There's a lot of options. And then you start implementing it. You start doing the hard work of, let's do the zoning changes. And let's, develop the programs and figure out how we want to deal with, what's the word, rehabilitation, that kind of thing. There's different grants that the city can apply for working on zoning issues. So for instance, Scott's department has been granting funds for cities to do zoning code audits and revisions. The Transportation Growth Management Department, which is between ODOT and DLCD, do they do code audits for housing?
I do, yes.
Okay, I couldn't remember if that was special. So there's different sources of that. You can also get a grant potentially, if there's funds, to choose one or two of your strategies in here and work through what would it take to implement this strategy. So maybe you want to, bless you, evaluate, for instance, the tax abatement program. What one would make sense for Lakeview. Maybe you want to evaluate different approaches to rehabilitation. If there's funds for that, the city could apply for a grant to do that as well, or any of the other strategies there. All right. Are there any questions?
One of the frustrations that we've had with the housing that has been made is that heating, the houses that have these huge ceilings that go up,
Crazy.
forever. They're paying nothing for rent, but they're paying $300 a month to heat a little house.
That's
Or
the HUD housing places at the south
Yeah,
and north end,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
HUD is making you do that?
Yeah.
It's
They built
just,
those houses.
it's just
It's-
crazy.
They built
Yeah.
vaulted ceilings, and of course all of the heat.
Do they not understand that this is a cold place?
The developer was paid based on, what it cost to build. So they got a percentage of the cost. So they spent every penny they could to make, this Cadillac house that was unheatable.
And it looks good and it makes it appear larger, obviously.
Right.
But it's not, once again, it's not affordable.
It's not cost effective
You
at
should
all
see
for
one.
these people.
It's crazy.
It could almost be a two-story home.
Yeah, I mean,
Easily.
If it was,
it would be nice if it was a
Lofted,
two-story
yeah.
home.
Yeah.
Can you address that sort of thing in design standards? In a code, I'm not a code expert. But can you give,
Yeah, we would, I think we would probably throw up some red flags if we saw it again, but at the building department, we would. We'd be like, whoa, what's going on here? I mean, that was years ago, it was before.
Is there a retrofit option so they could put fans to
I
bring
don't
that
know, this was
down?
all done in '04, '05.
It said on ceiling fans can be
This was
very.
on the start of our, for our influx of, the prison.
Right.
I'm gonna
Is where this
turn this loud thing
whole
off.
thing came from, but
So I guess I'm saying that we need to be really smart if we're gonna build multi-family places. They need to be affordable all the way around.
Yes,
You know, I
they
mean-
do need to be affordable in terms of energy efficiency.
Energy efficient, all that, because we've got a number of
And
people
you-
that have been in and are out because they couldn't.
But you wanna be careful with your energy efficiency standards. Like, I only know LEED a little bit, so LEED bronze is the lowest level of energy efficiency, and it adds costs to the building. And maybe that's sufficient, you don't need LEED platinum.
Right.
I keep watching in Eugene, our elected officials try to design, like a new city hall or a new county courthouse, going towards the LEED platinum. And maybe bronze or silver is good enough.
Yeah.
So, you have to be careful about overpricing and pricing people out of it.
8-foot ceilings would be good.
Exactly, 8 foot would be much better than 12 foot.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, is there any other questions? All right, well, thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Beth.
This information, certainly, thank you. I'm really glad you're here. And you played our little